In other words, it's just an infinite possible model for an architecture. Unlike, you might say, the Aqua Tower, here the perturbation does change the interior organization, and so the section is activated, unlike the balconies on the Aqua Tower. Now, of course, the critics saw this as a failure, too, because, we don't want skateboarders and people climbing up, and those dumb architects didn't think of that. They got people skateboarding on those things. What idiot architects? And I think that this is also the problem with criticism, that, somehow, the kind of legality mind of we don't want skateboarders up the chips. It's basically like what they did is discovered another possible activity within the form of organization generated by the architects, not necessarily expected by it, but rather than see that as a failure, which is what critics and criticality typically do, why not appropriate it as its success? In other words, it solicited another set of activities, maybe unanticipated, but that it's a form that allows that sort of thing to happen. But of course, the critics see it as a failure of architects to figure out that people will use the space differently. And I think that within this problematic critical reception of the pavilions, what you really get then, there's three versions of it, one of which is the sociology of the problem. How did these people get chosen? Why did they get chosen? Why didn't Chicago architects get chosen? The second thing is dumb architects, these cheap buildings, they got ruined, they had skateboarders on them. Architects need to be kept in line through the practicalities of budget and time and safety of people. And then the third kind is a metaphoric criticism. It's like they're massive ice cream scoops or a broken sliding board, or, that this is the three genres of criticism you get. But you've never gotten any serious criticism about what it is that the pavilions stand in for architecturally. In other words, because I think that both pavilions are, successful in their terms and within their limited conditions. But they represent, fundamentally different projects. The Zaha Pavilion, which has these aluminum tubes with this plywood ground plane, and then it's sheathed in a fabric mesh, which in fact is what took the time. There it is sheathed. So, you could say, unlike the Von Berkel Pavilion, the UN Studio Pavilion, which does all its jobs with one thing. First of all, this pavilion needs three different systems to do its job. But the thing is that they're all doing the same job. In other words, the outline of the floor plan, the tubes, and the stretched fabric are all reiterating the same thing. So the fact that you have three different systems, they're all essentially doing the same reiterative of the geometry. And I would say that, what the two pavilions stand in for, I think, are two contemporary possibilities of architecture, which I would call the parametric, which is the Zaha Pavilion, and the diagrammatic, which I would call the UN Studio Pavilion. And in fact, Zaha's partner, I can't think of his name now. Yeah, Patrick Schumacher, has coined the phrase parametricism as the new style of the 21st century. That in fact this will replace not only the international style, but in fact the Gothic. It will be a kind of trans-global union that will spread everywhere through every office, and that parametricism is the future. Now Patrick is a crazy German fundamentalist, but at least he put ism on the end, so I appreciate that. Yeah. Because most of the parametrics crowd, let's face it, is an iddie crowd. So at least Patrick is going for the style and the fact that it's a movement, and but for Patrick, of course, it's inevitable because he's German. They invented inevitability. But I think that the idea that that a parametric architecture, which is more or less exhausted through all of the parameters or facts that will be equalized and then registered as the final result. In other words, largely through the techniques of a kind of geometric modeling, but basically you could take the existing forces of a site, run them through your equalizer. It's updated Chris Alexander really, and get the proper form. I think diagrammaticism is not about that at all. In other words, parametricism relies on a version of reality which happens to be the facts as they are, and you model them, and they become the result. Diagrammaticism basically says we can organize the world a different way than it is. Let's try this way out, and it's transportable. It's not of its site, even though it can work in a site and rearrange conditions. So the extent that I think that the diagrammatic project is more projective than the hyper-mimicking of presumed real conditions and constraints, which is really the parametric project. So I think they really stand for two different visions. I also think that the parametric model, you do have to be a geometric or at least algorithmic fundamentalist. I think geometry in the case of UN Studio is agnostic. In other words, it's square when it needs to be square, and it's curved when it needs to be curved. There's no particular fundamentalism or essentialism about the geometry. It does what it has to do when it has to do it. And obviously the diagram has been exported even before it landed in Chicago, but will be exported other places as well. This is the trefoil diagram from the Mercedes Museum of UN Studio, which is essentially the same as the roof plan of the pavilion. But not only amateur critics, I would say, but also professional critics. Blair Kamin is the Chicago Tribune professional critic. This is my beat up on Critics Day. In the name of our own MA in design criticism. As a kind of salon de refuse, because the no Chicago architects were in the pavilion, they did a show called Big Bold Visionary of Chicago architects. Some work was good, most of it was not good. It was horribly curated in a terrible space. It was just pretty much an awful show. Lynn Becker, of course, said it's a great and excellent show. Blair Kamin also gave his nod and said it was, basically a good show. And Blair here says his favorite is in the sunny George Jetson genre, envisions public vehicles powered by an umbrella of magic energy that would float over the city, freeing CTA land for green space. So this is the project of this show that Blair likes. Again, it was not a very good show and not much future to it. There was another proposal, really actually in my mind a modest proposal, certainly graphically modest, by Stanley Tigerman, and this is Blair on that project. Stanley Tigerman would get rid of, or to use his euphemism, de-accession some low-density neighborhoods while pushing for higher-density living along Lake Michigan and the Chicago River and making way for urban farming. The architect, presumably, does not live in a neighborhood that would be de-accessioned. So this is Blair condemning this project. Meanwhile, as long as people don't move and they fly around in electric magic umbrellas, that kind of fantasy of the future is fine. But to actually rethink the organization of the city is a problem for Blair, because basically he has what I would call also this reality principle of criticism, which is, your 5-year-old would have a more sophisticated view of architecture, as if this proposal meant that all these people were going to be moved into internment camps along the river and lake, as opposed to really what it is, which is a thought experiment about a future development trend. And that this is the way architecture works in terms of counterfactuals and scenarios and envisioning alternatives, not by magic carpet rides through the city, but by really thinking like what different shape could a city take, what if scenarios. In other words, there's no ability in the critical establishment to tie a project. You assume that it's related to that reality in that moment with certain constituencies. You don't imagine that a project takes place in the discipline of architecture that then might feed back and change the way the city happens. There's no trajectory of relating this to a history, i.e. of O.M. Unger's Green Archipelago for Berlin, which areas of Berlin were in a sense de-accessioned as green spaces as the city de-densified, or OMA's proposal for Point City, where in fact the entire population of the Netherlands was going to be re-centralized in the erstwhile green heart of the country. Of course, if Blair Kamin were a Dutch critic, he would say, clearly the architect does not live in those other parts of the Netherlands. It's this sort of outrage criticism that